Well, hello friends. My name is Enton Eller from Ambler, Pennsylvania, and I'm your technical host for this webinar. Welcome to everyone who is joining us, and we're looking forward to a great presentation in this coming hour. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items that I'd like to share with you. To start with, in the upper left-hand corner is the chat window where you're welcome to make comments and post questions for our presenter as it goes. Please post at any time and we'll gather those together at different points in time. But also if you have technical issues or questions, post them for me there as well, and I'll be glad to help as I can. I'd also like to call your attention to the window right above me that lists all of our upcoming webinars. Feel free to scroll down and see that list. There's several that have taken place already, and we have recordings available. You may want to circle back and catch some of those, but also we have a great schedule coming up, so stay in tune with what we have being broadcast. And then finally, for those of you that are desiring continuing education units through the Church of the Brethren, I'll be sharing those instructions at the end of the webinar of how you can apply for and receive those for watching the online presentation in real time.
Greetings, everyone. We're extremely pleased that you are able to be here today for today's webinar from your location around the globe. Today's webinar is on the family and how the scriptures are passed to the next generation. And we are enthused to have the Reverend Dr. Howard Worsley as the presenter for today's webinar. Howard is a researcher, a teacher, a priest. He is the vice principal and tutor in mission at Trinity College in Bristol. He earned a BA in English, a master's in theology, and a PhD in education. He has wide experience in church ministry, mission, education, research, and children's work. And his work has included being senior lecturer in Christian education at Canterbury Christ Church University. He is a researcher into children's spirituality and their early perceptions. He is also a contextual theologian and an educationalist who publishes quite regularly for academic journals in his field. His background is varied and quite rich in terms of his personal work history. He has previously worked as a secondary school teacher, God bless you, a scripture union worker, an Anglican vicar, a university teacher of theology, a director of education, as well as a chaplain in both the higher education and further education sectors. His connecting themes are contextual theology and young people, and his interests are in the area of sports and travel. He is married to Ruth, who is the Archdeacon of Wiltshire, and he is the father of 3 sons. And with all that experience and wisdom, will you please join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. Howard Worsley as our presenter for today's webinar. Howard?
Howard, we don't have your mic live yet. If you could unmute that and join us again. Thank you.
Okay, are we live?
There you go. Thank you. All ready.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Stan. I hardly recognise that. And I think in what I'm about to talk about, the family and how the scriptures are passed to the next generation, the most important thing that, of all those things you've said about me, is that I'm a parent. So I think my children have taught me an awful lot, but I've also listened a lot to what the researchers say. Can I just read you a few verses that were written 1,000 years before Jesus Christ? They come from the Psalms, and in Psalm 78 we hear these words: Give ear, my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to my words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable and utter dark sayings from of old, things we've heard and known that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might, the wonders which he's wrought, which he commanded our fathers to teach to their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children. I don't know about you, but I get quite excited listening to that, because that is the psalmist talking about generational passing on of the scriptures, the story of God, the testimony to Yahweh, and that is the tradition that has come down to myself and to yourselves listening, and I'm very interested to make sure that we do this really well, because I'm not sure that we often do. So I'm going to start by just giving you an overview of my session. There are 5 sections to this session. The first is biblical perspective on the family, and I'm going to try and make a big difference between how the Bible views family as opposed to what is often the predominant model of family, the nuclear family seen in the West. And it's quite important that we hear how different that is. I'll just give you a little quote from somebody I was reading today. He says, "The myth of the nuclear family in the UK and in the West is not supported by either scripture, current statistics, or sociological studies." Okay. Every so often, by the way, I'll pause and if I say things like that you want clarification on, or you might not agree with that, please have a little discussion with me. I enjoy rapport with folks. So we'll start off by looking at biblical perspectives on the family. Secondly, we'll look at historical perspectives on the family, and particularly I'm going to look through the eyes of theologians. Most people who write about the family are sociologists, but theologians are a voice, and they're beginning to write more about children in this generation, and that pleases me no end. And it's a very interesting thing to log back through history and to see how theologians have viewed children and the family. And I'm going to tell you a little story. The story of the man who planted trees. I like stories. I tell stories a lot. I tell them to children, and they tell stories to me. The 4th section is the role of the family in allowing children to access scriptural meaning. Allowing children. Interesting. Well, maybe it's simply making sure that the children hear what the Bible is saying so that they can engage with it without it being dumped on them. It's allowing the child to reason with the parent or the grandparent or the adult and maybe offer their ideas as well. I've got some ideas as to how we talk to children so that we allow them to offer their insights so they're not just passive recipients. You know what? That makes them into theologians. And finally, a few comments about how children find faith in families. And you'll find that by the time we've got to that part, and I hope we do get to that part, families will mean a very extended understanding, and it will not simply be a nuclear family. So, let's go. Biblical perspectives on the family, and I'm looking at the Old Testament first of all. The Hebrew, Bethab, or the home or the house of my father. And a quick romp through the Old Testament gives us a little understanding of how the household is understood and what it means like for man and woman to come together and for the child maybe to be born. So, Genesis 2 verse 24 says, "A man will leave his father and his mother and cleave to his wife, and they will become as one flesh." Now, it's a particular union that sets up the family. Genesis 4 verse 9, just a couple of chapters later, shows us that this family that was brought into being was dysfunctional from very early stages. Because, as you know the story, it's a rather violent story of Cain and Abel. And I read, the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" It killed him. As we move on through Genesis, we come to Genesis chapter 6, verse 18, and here, as I read straight out to you, we read God speaking to Noah, telling him to build the ark, and in the ark he wants a family to survive. And these words are recorded. "I will establish my covenant with you, Noah, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, your sons' wives with you." So there's the sense of the ark as a unit of salvation and this early family floating on the waters above the chaos of the flood. And moving a little bit later into Genesis chapter 17, we come to chapter 17 verse 12, and a covenant that God has with Abraham, and the covenant of circumcision. And he says, "He that is 8 years old amongst you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner, who is not of your offspring. Both he that's born in your house and he that is bought with your money shall be circumcised." What we need to hear there is that it's not just a little unit of mummy, daddy, and children. We're hearing the ark is a family of Noah and his wife and children. They're all saved, all 8 of them. And then we've got Abraham, and the notion of household is a unit of inclusion. That's everybody under his roof. And in those days that would have been servants and slaves. Anybody who was under Abraham's roof would have been considered to be in his family. Let's move into the New Testament. That's me moving it further on, pushing next, and it's not moving. Anton, this is where I need you, my friend. Can you move? Yeah, thank you. Lovely. In the New Testament, we have the word oikos, the household, and Jesus is very clear about the sanctity of marriage, the value of what it is to be married. So let me just read you a few verses here. Matthew 19, verse 5. Jesus says, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. They're no longer two, but one flesh." So we have the initial start of the family. Then if we move on into Ephesians 6, we notice just as in the Old Testament, it's often dysfunctional. So I will offer you, I'll tell you what, you can read that for yourself, because I'm flipping through my Bible, I'm not finding it in a hurry. But as you know, in the New Testament, quite often there were times when the early church had to write about how to handle family unity and the behaviour within the home. If we move into 1 Corinthians 7, still mirroring some of the terms I was using for the Old Testament, we've got 1 Corinthians 7, verses 1 and 2, where we see it as a unit of salvation. And the Apostle writes, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it's well for a man not to touch a woman, but because of the temptation to immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband." Goes on like that, talking about the Christian marriage, being celibate for each other, and then as being a place where people are welcome. In Acts, we see that the notion of inclusion, and most famously, we have that passage in Acts chapter 16, verse 30, when we see Paul being released from prison, and the Philippian jailer is about to fall on his sword, and he calls out, "What must I do to be saved?" And the apostle said, "Believe in the Lord Jesus and you'll be saved, you and your household." Now that passage has caused an awful lot of theological interest down through the years. But basically, people understand that to mean that the entire household of that jailer would have been saved, and they would have been baptized that very night. So it's an interesting understanding that because the jailer knelt to Jesus, all those in his home, so we presume that would have been his wife if he was married, or his children. It would have been the servants within the home, anybody under that household. And finally, as a reference, I just offer you Matthew chapter 12, and chapter 12, verse 46. We see a complex story of Jesus asking who his mother is. And he stretches his hands out to his disciples and says, "Here are my mother and my brother. Whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and my sister and my mother." So Jesus is stretching the notion of family very widely indeed. Let's move on. Now, this being the case, I'll just do an overview of some of the things then that have come out of that scriptural analysis of family. That we see it as a close-knit community, a covenant community, a godly community, caring and supporting community, an exemplary community, salvific community. That's one where people are safe and where they're brought to salvation. And I particularly like us to think about that as being a good place for children to be brought up and for the story of God to be told in new ways. And it's a residential extended family. Now, let's just look at a little bit about some of the children in the Bible. I wonder who you think of when you think of children in the Bible. I've just taken a little selection, and I'll just very briefly mention these people who are mentioned from their earliest childhood in the Scriptures. Moses comes to us as an endangered species. Poor little chap is in danger of his life, and his mother puts him into a Moses basket. She floats him on the Nile, and he is saved by some very cunning conversations with the ladies who come down the river. Moses, the great leader of the Old Testament, comes to us as an endangered child. Joseph, the great Joseph, the Pharaoh's right-hand man, as a young guy, his father's favourite son, is seen to be fractious. I really like the way the Bible is so warts and all in its approach. It offers us a family that I recognise. I am a father of 3 sons. They're good guys, but believe me, sometimes they're fractious. And that's even now in their old age when they come back to see their old man. Samuel, this wonderful little boy, given by his mother into the temple when he's just a little boy. And little Samuel it is who hears God when the word of the Lord was not often heard. Samuel did hear. Maybe my favourite story, and the one that's occupied my thinking most recently, and I've written quite a lot about her, is Naaman's little maid. This little girl, we don't even find out her name, but we notice that she's torn from her family home by Naaman, who's a warrior, and brought to Assyria, hundreds of miles from Israel. And maybe just looking at some of the violence going on in Syria right now has attracted me to the story. But Naaman's little maid, there she is in the hands of her captor, is a little girl who nonetheless tells her captor about a God who saves, and a God who heals. You know the story. How about the story of Josiah, the king at the age of 8? What a war-torn world he was born into. And yet this little king was the one who is reputedly the one who brought the Bible into the hands of God's people again after it had been forgotten. I'm hearing here an incredible statement, how God within the narrative of Scripture is telling us of the importance of children in the transmission of the gospel. And here's Josiah discovering the book of the law. And now we come to Jeremiah. We don't know very much about his early years, other than when he was young, he was told to value his status as a little man and to trust in the God who was calling him. So these are the children in the Bible. There are many others that we could have picked on, but I just bring those out as people that God has used in the transmission of his purposes within the Judeo-Christian narrative. Now I'm coming on to the second section, and then I'm going to pause for a little bit because I'm hoping that I'm saying a few things that might be something you want to comment on. And I'm seeing some people commenting up on the board to my left. So let's just look at some of the historical perspectives seen through the eyes of theologians. You know, obviously, that the early church was persecuted, and persecution of parents did not have a good impact on child rearing. Clearly, the early church thought that Jesus was coming back any day, and that therefore they were expectant, they looked out, waiting for the coming again of Jesus, but their lives were in danger, and because of this, the record seemed to suggest to us that there was some concern about raising children. Then, as the church got settled into its stride after the conversion of the Roman Emperor, we can see Chrysostom talking about children as proto-monks. He wanted to see children in the monastery as people who would be pure vehicles, who would pass on the faith because they're innocent and childlike, and maybe they would be more effective Christians. Move that on to the next slide. Yep. Let's come to Anselm. Anselm, that's into 10th century. He continued to see them as gifts to the monastery. And not long after that, Abelard, sadly, sees them as a bit of a bother to the theologian in his writings. And by the way, if anybody's interested in having a quick romp through the theologians, can I just show you a book that is just brilliant? It's called Children and the Theologians, Clearing the Way of Grace. And it's written by Jerome Berriman, a good friend of mine. And I just want to say that he's done a lot of work for us by giving us an overview of some of the early attitudes to children and families. I'm fascinated by the story of John Bunyan, probably because it was told, the story of Pilgrim's Progress was told to me when I was a little boy, and it still lives in my head very powerfully. But I noticed that in this story, Pilgrim flees from children on his spiritual journey. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but the man, when he is called to deal with the sin on his back, and he's called to Calvary, he leaves his family, he leaves his wife called Christiana, and he sets out, leaving them lot to get on with it. And the rest, of course, is history. But we need to notice that this Puritan writer, effectively in his story, tells us about children being left behind. They're not comforting him when he's doing it. However, little known to many people, there's another book, Pilgrim's Progress 2, also written by Bunyan, Christiana's story. And this story actually does include the children. And that interests me to notice that there's been a general sort of suspicion, a prejudice maybe, that children are the concern of the mother. And she is the one who brings them on the journey, the same journey that Christians took. Jonathan Edwards, the famous preacher, the saw them as beloved vipers who needed conversion. And I've given you on the screen here a picture of a knot. Can we just stop with this for a moment? Because I think a lot of people, they might not have thought about it, but they view children as being knotted. Another way of saying it is that children have got original sin. That in other words, their default position is to be sinful. And that as such, the job of our work with children is to undo the knot, is to help the little creatures to become saved. Now, this is no doubt something we can talk about, but Jonathan Edwards very clearly saw this as the case, that children carried original sin within them, and that any work with the child is to get them converted and to unravel the knot. Now, there is an alternative way of viewing the child, and I offer to you Karl Rahner, a theologian, a Catholic theologian, who instead of focusing on original sin, focuses on original blessing. And he sees the child as being a seed, carrying the seed of God within the child. And that's a gift that goes back pre-fall, that God in creation made all of us people who are made to relate to God, and that even within the brokenness of the human condition, we are to be people who know God naturally. It's a far more positive way of looking upon the child, and therefore people who would use this notion of the seed as opposed to the knot will think of nurturing the child rather than evangelizing the child. And maybe we want to discuss that in a moment. Right, I've come to my third section, and I think it's time for a pause. Over to you, Stan.
Howard, thank you for sharing with us. With your question of children that come to mind, we raised that on the board, and we got lots of different responses of people, of children that they thought of in the Bible. And then some even started talking about how powerful it is to think about the unnamed children that Jesus encounters and gathers up in blessings and blesses. And then for many of us, we're aware of some of the violence that is happening with families and children in Nigeria, where there's quite a bit of violence and persecution that's taking place. So those things have come into the equation as well. Matt raises a question. He says, my argument with the comment that you made would be that children are unknotted, and as we grow older, we get knotted more, and we tie ourselves up and away from God. Children don't have that problem. Would you like to say something about that, or respond to that question or that statement?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I think that's very helpful. I actually tend to agree with you that children show us something about the original vision, the original blessing of God, and as such, if we look at children, we can see something that is very natural and right. But of course, that is only one side of it, because not all children are perfect all the time, and even small children show aspects of sinfulness. And the flip side being the idea of the knot, that also tells us a truth. I personally want to wrestle with these two things. I think there's something about the knot and the nut, or the seed. When I'm talking to my students, we often just see this as a tension, so that we are listening to the child to nurture their insights, but we're also aware that there is a sinfulness within creation. But it'd be really nice to talk to you face to face. This is often the sort of subject that gets my students buzzing for quite a long time.
Yeah.
With that, Stan, can I also go on?
Yeah, go ahead.
Now, I noticed, I couldn't help seeing as I was scrolling down, somebody mentioned Jephthah's daughter. You know, that rather unpleasant story. It's a horrific story of a king returning from a battle and offering to God his child as a sacrifice, because he believed that's what God wanted. I actually, a few years ago, wrote this book. It's called A Child Sees God, and I divided the stories within the Bible into 7 categories, and one of the categories I used was texts of terror. And I just wanted to say that I think Jephthah's daughter's fate is a text of terror. It's a horrific story, and I think we need to distance ourselves from that sort of abuse of children being offered as sacrifices. And indeed, if we were to talk even about Abraham and Isaac, that this is a story which has bothered many people through the years, most notably the great philosopher called Kierkegaard, who was traumatized by this notion of being offered as a sacrifice to God. And I think when we see these stories in the Bible, we need to treat them with supreme care, and be duly warned as well as to what we're reading.
There's a Matt's comment that was fueled by your remarks. Created a couple more responses. Jackie shares, are both things going on when you were talking about the knotted and the seed? I see the divine image, but aren't children touched by the knottedness of the human condition from the beginning of their lives as well? And then Eleanor responds, I certainly agree that we get more knotted as we grow, but who taught my 4-year-old to choose to lie? They must also have the capacity and propensity to sin even within a very young child. So would you want to say more or respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a mystery here, but the question about nurture and nature has vexed theologians and vexed educationalists and psychologists from the beginning. But I personally see it as something of both. But I still would rather talk about the seed, because the original blessing came before original sin. If you think about it, the writer John Calvin talks about the human being being made as a mirror image of God, but that mirror has been dropped and shattered, but that each sliver of mirror still reflects God. And I think rather than focusing on the shatteredness of the mirror, let's also say that the mirror still reflects God. I see an awful lot of good out there, and I hear children telling me an awful lot about God. And of course, I don't want to be sentimental or naive, but I have a feeling that within the West we have had a theology that's been dominated by Augustinian thought, which gave rise to this Calvinistic thought, which basically emphasizes the fall or the original sin more than the original blessing. So, hey, in my life, I'm quite happy to do a bit of tilting it back the other way.
Yeah. Howard, let me get to one other comment. Kathy writes, I wonder if the unknottedness is something of what Jesus meant when he said that unless we become like children. And I know that's a big theme for you. And so I'll give you a chance to respond now, or perhaps you want to share that later, whatever you'd like to do.
I just say, Kathy Fry Miller, you're a good lady. That's very much something in my heart. Yes, that Jesus was talking to adults, and with the child in their midst, he said, unless you become like children, you're not even going to enter the kingdom of heaven. You know, I want to get passionate about that. That Jesus is not pulling his punches here. There's something about the child. There's something about what it means to be a child that we must be like. And we can ask what that is. And again, the theologians are never in agreement. but they are all in agreement that the child is a creature of no status. In the days of Jesus, the child had no rights. Little children were often thrown out of the home or left to die on a hill. There's somebody that's done a recent PhD on this as to how the Romans treated children.
Yeah.
So when Jesus said, unless you become like a child, he's saying, when you're in my presence, you've got no rights, but I love you. You're wanted. And the call of the adult disciple is to become like a child. And if we don't do that, we don't enter the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah.
Powerful word.
Excuse me, Howard, I'm going to step away so you can continue your presentation because we don't want to use your time with all these questions, but we will get to as many as we can.
Thank you. Okay, let me tell you a story. This is a rather beautiful story about the man who planted trees. I won't take too long telling it to you, other than there was a man around about 1910 walking the hills in Sweden, in Uppsala, and he'd walked all day and he'd expected to find water, but instead of water he just found dried ditches. And he came to a village, and the village had been abandoned and there was no water. There was a dried fountain in the middle. And as he walked on, he became seriously nervous about whether he would find any water. And on a distant hill, he saw a figure. And with great relief, he walked towards the figure, and he found a shepherd with his sheep near a pool of water. And he thankfully had a drink, and because the day was far spent, he asked the shepherd if he could go back to his house and rest the night. And he did so. That night, the old shepherd, who didn't speak very much, lay down on his couch, but before he went to sleep, he took a big bag from the side of his bed and counted out 100 acorns and put them into a smaller into a smaller bag. He checked that each of the acorns was not cracked. When he got his 100, he rolled over and went to sleep. In the morning, our traveller decided to follow the shepherd, the silent shepherd, and the shepherd, as he walked over the hill, used his stick to drill into the ground and to drop an acorn. And this so fascinated the walker that he asked the shepherd to clarify what he was doing, and he got no response. But he came back the next year and walked again the hills of Uppsala. And he came back every year to spend time with the old shepherd. Then, for a few years, he wasn't able to go because a war took place that he was called up to. But he came back in 1919 to Uppsala again. And this time when he came, all over the hills, there were trees up to shoulder height. And he wandered through the acres of trees and finally found the shepherd. And the shepherd was still going out every day planting 100 trees. He was no longer keeping sheep because sheep tended to nibble at the trees. The story goes on, and I could draw it out as much as I wanted, but the point of it is that 5 years later, the hills were covered in trees. And when he went back, 10 years after he'd first been there, he went back to that first village, which had a dried water well. And there were now people living in the village. There was water gushing out of the fountain. There was a stream running through the village. It's a story told by Jean Giono, illustrated by Harry Brockway in Woodprints in 1995. I'll just go back a bit, my friend. There we go. Yeah. Just pause for a moment, and I want to say that this story, which is not a theological story, it's just a story of human interest, reminds me of what we're doing every day, that we spend time with children and tell them stories and listen to them. It seems to me that where there is dryness, we see new life. every teacher in every school, every youth worker, every children's worker, every family worker, every grandparent, everybody who's spending time with children is actually being part of planting a seed and seeing it growing up. So it's Karl Rahner's notion, I think, of the seed that motivates me. And I just love this story. And I particularly love the fact that it brings communities together and that we have water flowing as a result. And I have a dream, actually, that the church will again hum with children and that their insights will be heard. And as the story is told with greater vigour, we will also hear the children giving us new insights, and the trees will proliferate. There you are. That's my story, just to let you have an oblique way of thinking. Let me tell you a little bit about some research that I've done as we look at the role of the family in allowing children to access scriptural meaning. About 5 years ago, I told the story of Noah's Ark to children in different contexts, and in schools and in homes. And as I did so, I then asked the children, they were all years 5 and 6, that is that's age 10 or 11, by the way. I asked the children if they could tell me the story back as a cartoon, and the cartoon would have 4 pictures. So I'm just showing you the story of Noah's Ark told by Rachel in a church school. So she shows Noah and God's hand coming out of heaven, and Noah being told to build an ark. He builds the ark in the second picture, and the rain comes down and the floods come up. In the third picture, we see the rain continuing, the rain stopping, but the floods continuing, and a bird flying out of the ark. And in the fourth picture, we see the ark coming to rest on top of a mountain. Now, I think that's a lovely way of thinking about it. But can I ask you, before I turn on to my next slide, if you think that's an accurate story of Noah's Ark? So we've got God talking to Noah, the rain coming down, the rain stopping, and the ark coming to rest. Let me show you another picture. This is a Muslim child, who also, by the way, attended the same church school in England. And this child didn't show any physical characteristics of God, because you're not allowed within Islam to depict Allah or the Prophet. And so just you see a big speech bubble. And now we see the second picture is Noah's Ark, and the animals coming into the ark. The third picture is the flood and the judgment as people die in the flood. And the fourth picture is of the ark finally coming to rest. Now, as I look at this particular picture of the story, I notice that it's a story of judgment, and this child notices that. And when I saw that, that made me reflect as to how quite often we tell the story of Noah's Ark within Sunday schools. Quite often it's told as being about animals, happy animals, mummy and daddy animals, hand in hand, going into the ark. And then they get into the ark and they float away, and then they come to rest, and then the sun comes out and there's a lovely rainbow and everybody's happy. But this particular story tells the story as a story of judgment. And I think technically the story of the flood is a story of judgment, but it's also got a story of the covenant within it. Now I'm interested, therefore, as to how the scriptural stories are told to children. I'm interested in the fact that quite often we feel the need to domesticate the stories and to make them a little bit more comfortable, so that the children will not get traumatized. Whereas I think generally within Muslim families, the story of judgment is told out loud and clear. Now, I think we need to think about that quite carefully as to how stories are told, how sanitized stories are. And people who have pondered on this, yeah, I've jumped the slide. I'll just keep on that theme for a minute. Maybe we can stop and just see if anybody wants to comment on this. But I think I want to say this, that it's very important that we tell children the stories within the scriptures as truly as we can without sanitizing them. But we tell them that within a place of safety. That the educationist called Vygotsky was very clear that within the zone of proximal learning, that means when the child is safe, sat on the mother's knee or the father's knee, or a bedside story told in the safety of the home, you can tell things that are quite difficult, and the child can peruse the meaning and wrestle with the complexities of the text. And I'd just like to ask you, who are listening to me, what do you think about this? Can I just tell you something slightly obliquely? Somebody did a survey of fairy stories, and they found out that when all the trauma is taken out of a fairy story, the children got bored with the story. So the three little pigs, you know the story? The stories that don't like the idea of the wolf coming down the chimney and falling into the pot and getting boiled, but just walking off somewhere. The children said, well, that's not fair, you know, why should that happen? That's a terrible story. Or the story of Hansel and Gretel, told by Grimm's brothers, where you've got children captured by a wicked stepmother and put into an oven. You know, not a very nice story, but children love it because it's got a happy ending, and the story told within the home, with the child engaging with the pain of what is the wood, of the dark wood, you know, Little Red Riding Hood. Well, what is this wood that we're going into? Well, what does it mean? The child will often have an interesting conversation, and I think we must learn within loving engagement to engage with some of the tough things that are going on in the world, but to give our child the time to reflect on it, and for us to reflect with the child, not for us just to dumb it down. Now, of course, this will also need to be qualified. So I think I've said enough for you to jump on me now.
Your comments, Howard, about sanitizing the story reminds me of a story with my own daughter when she was very young, and she made the comment as we were reading the story, and she goes, "Oh, you're not really telling me the truth, are you, Daddy?" There are some comments, and one is people did comment to the story about the older man who was planting trees, and they came up with other stories as well. Sean Hancock makes the comment, she says, godly play helps tell the stories as they are, but within a sacred space that offers the security to explore the starkness and sometimes the darkness. And then Liz also comments, in telling sacred stories, a lot of meaning is shaped by whether the focus is on God and grace, enduring covenant, and love, or by contrast, how we are disobedient we are as people. And I think that it's somewhat what is our understanding of God often shapes how we tell those stories. And so I invite you to comment to the comments that Sean and Liz have made as we go, if you'd like.
Yeah. So just telling you that. So the comment by Sean is, was that about passing the story forward? Yeah. And yeah, sorry, Stan. Can you just help me a little bit again to hear?
Yeah. Sean is about passing the story forward. As I read it, she says, godly play helps tell the stories as they are, but within a sacred space that offers the security to explore the starkness and sometimes darkness.
Yeah. Okay. Let me comment on that. I think godly play is a superb means of telling stories, mainly because it allows the child to engage in the story and to wonder. And indeed, they can wonder about the darkness. And I've often found that. So, telling the story, for example, of the lost sheep, and actually showing a sheep that gets lost, and then just wondering about it. The children often bring their own lostness into the story and into their comments at the end. It's a truly wonderful means of engaging with the child's contribution to the story. Because, of course, what godly play is doing, it's allowing the child to bring their story into the story being told to them. And that's the genius of it.
Yeah, very, very much so. And we have some comments that are moving back and forth. Anita or Sarah says, you said about telling children's stories in a loving and safe environment. What if others have told the story previously in a way that has given them a negative or unhelpful image of God? Can this be overcome by us retelling it, or will this image remain? And there's some comments that are going back and forth with that.
Yeah, there's a lovely book by John Hull called God Talk with Children, and he gives many illustrations that it's very important to engage with the child's perception. So if a child has got some painful notions that are arising out of the story, it's quite important that the adult who's telling the story listens to them and goes with the flow of the child. Doesn't just say, well, that's wrong, because that is not very satisfying to the child. Just to be told that, in fact, this is true and your perception isn't. But to actually explore why a child thinks and is engaging in this particular way, and to feed ideas in, and to work with, so to go with the grain of the child's concept within the story, I think is very helpful. By the way, I'm doing some research on this, a longitudinal research of children who hear Christian stories as small children, and then over their lifespan they process the stories. I'm doing this in 7-year chunks, and I'm quite intrigued actually that already it's becoming clear to me that where children have been allowed to process stories, which also means to sometimes live with the pain of a story, because it's not a complete story. There are stories in the Bible that are not complete. We as adults know this. They're traumatic stories. They're stories that they theologically embarrass us. But these stories, if a child is allowed to wrestle, they may over their life continue to wrestle theologically. And I think this is key to the notion of children actually finding a faith in the 21st century. So they don't feel they're being duped, but they feel they're being heard, and that they're hearing the story with all the complexities within it.
Yeah. So in the case of what we're sharing here, we're talking about, the possibility of, are we watering the Bible stories down to protect children, to create a safe environment? What does that mean for them? How does that reshape, or how does that shape and form their understanding of God and even of the Christian community when we do that? And then what does it mean to tell the story in its fullest? And do we understand that as well and make it as real and perhaps as harsh as those Bible stories can be at times too?
Yeah. I mean, the big narrative, of course, within the Scriptures is that God loves us, God created us, and when we fell away, God came and rescued us. And the story continues. We're in the story, and we go on to the eschaton, the end time, and we're going to be part of the story, the final story. It's a really good story. It's a happy meta-narrative. But on the way, with our place within that story, there are lots of painful things. And I think that's what I'm saying. That we're telling the story within the household of faith. That we believe that God is in control, and ultimately God will be there at the end, and He's with us now. But there's a lot of pain that we must wrestle with, and we must allow our children the dignity of engaging with the Scriptures, warts and all, as they grow up.
Yeah. Jackie made a couple comments, and I'm going to ask Jackie if she could retype her question or her statement, and that way I don't want to misrepresent what you're trying to share with us. Sarah shares that when we let children lead us and show us their reflections about the Bible, it often makes us feel uncomfortable, which is a good thing, she states. And then Eleanor, my experience is that children cope far better with the full scope of emotions and shades in the biblical stories, and it's sometimes the reaction of their parents, even non-believing, which is extremely negative when they hear. And perhaps, this says something about our own maturity, our own emotionality as we enter into these stories. What can you share with us about that and how we respond emotionally to our stories and how children respond?
I think my one thing is to say be real, and allow the child to know that we are in the story as well. You know what? We don't stand over the Scriptures. We as adults stand under the Scriptures, just like children do. So I think by us, both adult and child, reflecting on the Scriptures together, we are both trying to make sense of the Scriptures as being God's revealed word, and this is what allows a theological approach with our children. So we're not going to tidy it all up. We're going to say, I don't know why the Scriptures say that. Well, I'm going to say that. We're going to just wrestle with the Scriptures.
Yeah. And I think Sean makes with her question, do we sanitize and make the changes for children for our own comfort and resolution? And perhaps so. So there's lots of wonderful comments. Howard, let me just allow Enton to come in and share some information for the end of our webinar, and then we'll turn it back to you and for concluding comments and other thoughts that you'd like to share. Enton?
Thank you.
Thanks, Stan. Sorry. Thank you, Stan. We'll keep the questions and comments going, so Howard and Stan stay with us. But as we're coming to the end of our time, for those that may need to leave, there's two quick questions that I've put up. The first is, how helpful was the presentation, meaning the content and the learning? And the second is, how well did you like this webinar format, meaning this online meeting? So if you could take a moment, everyone who's here participating, just to check one response on both of those questions. And then for those of you that might wish to find continuing education units for your participation, I've put up there the information about how to obtain those. There's an online form. If you can fill those out within the next day, that would be great. And I've posted a live link in the chat window as well to make it easier. But I would suggest you not follow that link until all these questions are done, because I don't want you to lose out. So Stan and Howard, back to you. Continue on.
Thank you, and thank you, Anton. And then Howard, what thoughts would you like to leave for us as we come to towards the conclusion of our webinar today? This has just been wonderful.
Thank you, Stan. I think if there's one thing I want to say, is that give children dignity and respect their perception. So that when you have a conversation with children, expect to have your insights opened. And just the other thing, of course, is to encourage you to tell stories to children regularly. Make a real importance of the occasion. have it as a, I'm just reading, I've got 6 points here at the end of the book I wrote. It's got a timing about it, it's a special event, there's an ambience that the child looks forward to and you look forward to it. It's a sacred moment, and it's a time when you reflect together under the scriptures. I think those are what I really want to say. That as the story goes on, it's not our story, it's God's story, and we are privileged to share it with our children.
Howard, just wanted to ask, I know that in your slides you also have some resources listed. Would you be open to sending me a copy of the PDF file of your PowerPoint, and then people can contact me at sduick@brethren.org, and I will then send them a copy of the PowerPoint file, if that would be okay. We've had a number of requests for your slide.
Absolutely, I'd love to do that.
Liz made a comment just before as we came out of that last break, and she said, in a recent adult class on the Midrash, we explored stories of Moses and Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac. And these are stories that adults continue to wrestle with and define meaning and understanding. But the temptation is to avoid telling them to children is understandable at times. Could you comment on that comment by Liz?
Yeah, no, it's a good one, Liz. The chapter I wrote on texts of terror explores that quite carefully. I personally think that if it's within the scriptures, these are stories that we can tell, but we need to tell them with huge care, and without us dominating the narrative, so that we tell them, and then we ask, what does this mean? Why should this be the case? You know, why did God tell Abraham to take Isaac? Did God tell Abraham to take Isaac? You know, I think that's a good question. Did Abraham, was he an old boy? Was he mishearing it? Was his culture something that thought that children should be sacrificed, and therefore he was living within his culture? You know, let's ask these questions. And I personally have often heard children wrestle with these and come up with better ideas than I have.
I just want to share also, you've mentioned stories of terror. In your book, you identify about 7 different areas or themes. Could you just briefly cover them for our participants as to what some of those other themes are as well?
Yeah, sure.
I think you'll find that your book very helpful.
Thank you. There's the texts of wonder, which is, I'll just quickly say the 7 texts. Texts of wonder, texts of adventure and leadership, texts of terror, fourthly, texts of justice and judgment, fifthly, texts of comfort and hope, 6, texts of comedy, I really like that one, 7, texts of mercy and forgiveness. And so texts of wonder, I'll just give you an example, that's the creation story. Texts of adventure and leadership, for example, David and his mighty man. Texts of terror, we've well discussed that. Fourthly, texts of justice and judgment. That's like banishment from Eden, or the sheep and the goats. Texts of comfort and hope. I put in there David and Goliath. I put the resurrection of Jesus. Texts of comedy, I put here Balaam's ass. I put there the unjust judge. I'd be interested in people to comment on those. Seventhly, texts of mercy and forgiveness. I put in Jonah and Zacchaeus. Anyway, I've given several classifications for each of those.
Yeah, I think there's some real wonderful aids in that, in what you cover in the book, and I'm glad that we can actually promote that text as well, because I think there's a lot of there's a lot of good resources there. Want to just ask you a question. Much earlier in the presentation, you talked about nurturing children versus evangelizing. And, in terms of the Church of the Brethren faith tradition, it has much more in common with that nurturing, that seeding. And so say more in which you see that happening in the church, and what kind of outcomes from your research are you finding in approaches that families or churches, faith traditions take in those regards?
Yeah, I think traditionally there's been a strong emphasis on the evangelizing of children because a concern as to their eternal salvation. So this notion of undoing the knot. But more recently, people are beginning to talk more comfortably about the seed, the idea of nurturing. So if I was to take a typical class of say 30 students, and talk about those two models, after they've been unpacked a bit, people would say that they're happier with the idea that our role is to nurture children, but they would also offer the caveat that we mustn't be naive about it. By the way, I always give them a third model as well, which is, I call it the knot, the nut, and the new sheet. The new sheet is the idea of the tabula rasa, the wax tablet that's not been written on, a clean sheet of paper. And educationalists tend to see children as clean sheets that are about to be written upon. And of course, all of them have got different insights, and they're different models. So I don't think one model is sufficient. The truth is, we only see through a glass darkly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Howard, this has been great. We have still some comments that we can go back and backtrack, but I think we'll just allow you to close with some final thoughts. And we've gone past the hour. We still have a number of people with us, so they're hanging on your words. And this has been great. We've had a lot of interaction and engagement, and I just wish we could have covered every comment. But I'll just invite you to just share some final thoughts and any comments you'd like to make.
Thank you. Well, can I just say to anybody who's been listening and engaging in this, to pick up your pens. You don't need to be a great scholar, but I've put up there on the screen the bibliography, and you'll notice that much of the writing about children and their insight has only come in the last 10 years. And I think it's our task in this generation for people to begin to see the insights of children, and to take them seriously, and to see them as major players theologically. So, don't be bashful. Bring it out. Children's workers often think that they're the underdogs of the theological world, that they are the people who are the most humble. You know what? Maybe we are the most humble, but I have a feeling that Jesus Christ would say something a bit different. And the insights of the child are up there with the highest.
And also just like to say that if you send me an email at sduick@brethren.org, we will get you a copy of that bibliography by way of the PDF copy of the slides today. And so you'll have that information for you, and you can use that for your own benefit and personal study as well. So, and we're getting a number of people, Howard, expressing their thoughts about the webinar. Excellent webinar, great conversation. Thank you, Gita. Jackie, really appreciate this. Thank you. Sarah, thank you. She says your thoughts have been provoking and interesting, and my gosh, the response in way of comments and everything, it really filled up, and so wonderful engagement. Simon, thank you. Wallace as well, thank you very much. This has been terrific. Very, very engaging.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that very much.
Well, Howard, we don't want to make your day extend as too late into the evening, because I recognize it's closing in on the hour of about 9 o'clock. And so Enton and I just want to extend a great deal of appreciation to you, your presentation, and your patience with us in a way of setting this up and all the internet intricacies that we've had to work through, and just appreciate all your energy that you have brought to this engagement.
Thank you, Stan. I've appreciated doing it.
And blessings on your ministry as a leader at Trinity, and also as a professor who's shaping and forming people in their faith and in their life journeys as well. Want to say
thank you, Howard. I'll give people just another quick 10 or 20 seconds to grab that link if they want CEUs, and then Stan, you'll get the last word, and I'll close the meeting.
All right. Well, to everyone that has been with us today from wherever you have joined us by way of internet and computer connection, we deeply appreciate the support that you're showing for these kinds of learning experiences. We are grateful to the many people that are behind the planning for these events, and especially to presenters like Howard, who make this possible. And we hope that your takeaways from this enrich your own spiritual journey, but also your ministry in which you find yourself, whether it's teaching, in parish ministry, in just other areas of life, even in your own, and especially in your own family. We just hope that these are takeaways for you that you can use in your setting, and we pray that they will be a rich blessing to you. Thank you for your support. Thank you for being here today. And if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share later, you can do that as well. I'll post my email address, and we're always delighted to hear the comments that you have to share with us, and also ideas as well. Thank you, everyone, and blessings to you, whether it is good afternoon or good night.